Hello and welcome to The Art of Conversation, a radio show dedicated to a college course dedicated to the art of conversation. This program is brought to you by the Eileen G. Jones Honors College and the Department of Communication Studies, Media, and Journalism at Commonwealth University in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. I'm your host, Eric C. Miller, Professor of Communication Studies. This show is the official radio presence of Honors 211, The Art of Conversation, a course that focuses on the ancient art of dialectic. That is, the collaborative process by which knowledgeable peers pursue the truth through focused question and answer, back and forth, what is often called Socratic discussion. After a few weeks of wading through the theory on these matters, our students spend about 10 weeks in practice holding twice weekly 75-minute deep dives into topics and questions of their choosing. Our theme this semester is the good life in the Great Acceleration, and all of our content falls somewhere within this intentionally wide umbrella. Each week, we're talking about how to live good lives in this era of soaring economic growth, technological innovation, labor market uncertainty, political turbulence, climate change, mass extinction, and on and on. My guests today are Andrea and Chloe, a pair of student moderators who this week asked us to think a bit about the ethics of testing products on animals. Andrea and Chloe, welcome to the show.
Hello. Hi.
Before we dive into our subject matter, maybe tell us a little bit about yourselves, where you're from, what's your major, what has sparked your interest in animal testing?
Hello, I'm Chloe. I'm a freshman psychology major, and this topic kind of interested me because as a psychology major, I could go down the path of research. So learning about animal testing is probably a must if I go into that. So I would like to learn more about the ethical concerns of what animal testing is.
My name is Andrea. I'm an exercise science major. Exercise science is closely related to psychology. They overlap a great deal. So I also need to be more aware of this as it happens not just in our university, but in our daily lives.
First things first, then, how do you feel about animals?
I mean, I love them. Aren't they cute and adorable? I mean, I have a pet dog, so I would do anything for my dog. He's just so cute. I feel like I have to protect him in any way. That can range from feeding him, taking him for long walks down my long sidewalk of a road. But I really care for animals.
Me too. I always grew up with animals. And in high school, I used to volunteer at animal shelters, specifically dog shelters. We imported the dogs from Texas from their kill shelters.
I think it's an important starting point because for some people, animals are not important. They're a natural resource. They are put on this planet for our use, and so we use them to try to make our lives better in various ways. And for other people, animals are extremely valuable and important and capable of suffering, and therefore they need to be advocated for and defended. And so we have a spectrum here from those who care about animals not at all to those who are joining, PETA or Greenpeace or things like that. Where do you fall on that spectrum?
I don't think I am like an extremist like PETA is, but I do think animals deserve some rights and should not be suffering in like any sort of treatment facilities.
I also agree. I feel like I'm not that extreme, that it is meaningful when it's used correctly. However, in some instances, it does not need to be used, and we're just causing them harm. And I feel like we forget that we ourselves are also animals who have the same feelings.
You got our discussion started in class by sharing with us a couple YouTube videos and a reading, and one of them raised the question of whether or not animals have moral status, or if they do, how much moral status they have relative to other types of animals or relative to humans. In your mind, what does the phrase moral status mean, and how do you evaluate how much a particular animal has versus another animal or versus a person?
I think moral status comes from like if you can feel pain, you can provide for other people, you support, you talk to, you communicate with other people. Morally, I think if you have the choices to do whatever, you have the choice to actively do something, then you're a living being, right? So morally, I think people have obligations and they have to follow those obligations. But I think animals do have that kind of moral status since they do provide for other animals. They provide for their own families.
I agree. We are the most of all. However, we all still do have emotions. And we can go about in our daily lives, making our own choices. So I feel like that individualization gives everybody moral status, including animals.
Okay, the question of what is most evolved or what is most intelligent seems to factor into this. And I know in the class, some people are suggesting that, certain animals are more intelligent than others. So like a chimpanzee maybe has a greater degree of moral status than, I don't know, a rat or like a dolphin or a pig, some other animal that is known to be intelligent. A dog, can be taught things and can be trained, maybe has a greater degree of moral status than an insect or a fish or something else that doesn't have the same sort of capability. Does that factor into it in your view?
In my view, it factors a bit. I think all animals have the ability to learn, regardless if they're a bird, a rat, an insect. I think all animals are able to learn, so it's kind of hard to put a ranking on each animal.
There are other things we could take into consideration. So like intelligence is one measure maybe of moral status. Ability to feel pain is another. If an animal is particularly sensitive to pain, then maybe you would feel that they should be exempt from any sort of painful testing. But maybe it's their very sensitivity that makes them attractive as a test subject because they are going to give a stronger reaction to whatever is being tested or something. But anyway, let's flesh this out a little bit. When we talk about animal testing, what animals are we talking about and what is being tested on them?
When I first think of animal testing, it usually goes from mice, rats, birds, dogs, cats, but it can range from like many to many various animals, but mostly mice and rats, since those are ones that are very excluded from animal protection rights. So those are exempt from like the countings of how many animals suffer each year.
99% of animals used in laboratories are excluded from the Animal Welfare Act, including rats, mice, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians.
Maybe tell us a little bit about that legislation. What is the Animal Welfare Act and why was it passed and why does it exclude some animals?
It was made in 1966 and it was mostly to care about the treatment of animals. So it focused on the housing of how animals are treated, the food and water access, how they're humanely handled. So this mostly was sparked by human trials and how the International Review Board had been made due to ethical concerns with human testing. So then they also implied that animal testing should also have some boundaries as well. So I think that legislation mostly came in place due to the human kind of part of that.
What were they testing on humans back in the 60s?
They were doing some illegal vaccine testing. I think I forget the disease they were doing specifically, but there was one that about 300, I think, African-American men were part of, and that study went on for so long, and they injected the disease into them.
The Tuskegee experiment,
Yeah.
I think was syphilis, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm. And there was many experiments like that kind of sparked the journey to having legislature for them.
It was used to promote the physiological well-being of non-human primates. However, it doesn't cover, like we said, most of the animals still being used in experiments today. So I feel like that's important to note.
So were rats and mice excluded because of a lack of intelligence or because of a lack of ability to perceive pain?
Yeah.
But yet rats and mice, we're always teaching them how to solve mazes and stuff. So they are somewhat intelligent, are they not?
Oh yeah, definitely they are. I mean, I think mostly the reason why we use rats and mice is because we are about 95% genetically similar to them. So it makes it easier to test any sort of treatment on them so we can see the side effects of anything that we could possibly use on humans.
It also comes back to the moral status, how humans perceive them.
Is it because we think rats are gross?
Yes, we don't care as much about rats as you would a dog, because the dog, you are more closely related to it. You form that emotional bond that you're not forming with rats and mice. You want to keep them out of your house. You're not welcoming them in.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of why I asked the question. I mean, you had mentioned earlier, Chloe, you love dogs because they're cute and adorable. And I think the cuteness factor looms pretty large in this discussion. We are offended at the prospect of harming cute animals, but ones that we consider to be not cute, if they are hurt or if they're suffering, maybe people are less likely to care. What products are we testing on animals for the most part?
Mostly in the medical industry with vaccinations, the cutting edge technology that we're having, testing it on them. Only about 20% is used towards cosmetics. However, that is still a good percentage when you think about how many animals exactly are being tested in the US every year. More than 110 million animals are killed in US laboratories for various testing purposes.
I think that's a crazy number to think about, honestly. 110 million animals just in the US alone die each year. It could range from cosmetic testing or to vaccinations, to testing the safety of vaccinations, to chemicals or toxicity tests. But that blows my mind that each year, in just the US alone, it's 110 million.
And that's just the deaths alone, not even the exact number, which is around 192 million being used.
So not all of those 192 million die from the procedure, but they probably suffer, or at minimum, they're kept in like a small cage in a windowless room and that sort of thing. And if 20% of 110 million is going towards cosmetic testing, it's still like 22 million animals. The most famous examples that come to my mind are like rabbits. I've seen a lot of footage of rabbits getting chemicals poured in their eyes because I guess their eyes are genetically similar to human eyes. So you want to see what kind of effect it has. I know they do a lot of testing on beagles, which are dogs, and people love dogs. Why are beagles singled out? Do you know?
I don't know quite for sure, but I think it's something with their genetics, honestly.
Because it's specifically that breed. It's not all dogs.
It would be really kind of heartbreaking to me if they were chosen because they're more compliant or they're gentler. They're less likely to bite their handler or something like that. Now, when we discussed this in class, a lot of people seem to be defensive of animal testing based on the grounds that humans have problems that animal testing can solve, and that humans have a higher degree of moral status. And so especially if human lives are at stake, the suffering of animals or the loss of animal life is acceptable. You know, do you have a sense among these tests that are done for things other than cosmetics, how many of them are going to things that are going to actually save human lives at the expense of animal lives?
Well, that's the interesting part, because according to the FDA, more than 98% of drugs that are tested on animals are never sold in stores.
Why is that?
You go through such a lengthy process for animal testing alone that it's so hard to eradicate it. But also keeping in mind of the procedure that it goes through, it takes about 14 years for a new drug to even get approved and to be out on the market. You're spending about $1 billion or more on a single drug. And the failure rate is normally around 95%.
Why is it so high?
Because we test on animals. So, for example, HIV/AIDS had at least 85 vaccines that were successful in non-human primate studies. However, every single one of them has failed in humans. So we're testing on animals, but then when we finally switch over to human clinical testing, it's not proving effective. So we're spending all this money and it's just not going anywhere.
That seems like an enormous amount of animal suffering and death for very little return on investment in terms of life-saving medications for human beings.
I mean, taking into consideration that 2% of drugs are sold in stores, but only 0.02% of those animal tested drugs are ever made to the general public. It's unreal.
Would defenders of animal testing say that, okay, yeah, there's like a trial and error process. Not everything works and a lot of things get discarded, but it's through the process of testing these medications that we get the experience or the knowledge that we need to build the one that ends up, curing cancer or AIDS or something like that?
Yeah, that's understandable. It's a fair assumption. However, how realistic is it? Taxpayers are spending about $14 billion annually just on animal testing alone for not just medical, but everything. However,
it doesn't exactly work. To go from animal testing to humans, there's a very low chance that it will actually work, mostly due to side effects or lack of effectiveness in general. So it really breaks my heart to hear that all these animals are suffering just not even getting that vaccination out.
Also, considering that we're in the time of the Great Acceleration, you would think we would start to be switching to more alternative methods. Our cutting-edge technology, our computer software, or even just promoting more human clinical testing. So we know that what we're putting our money towards and the suffering that is occurring is actually being useful.
Well, what about those clinical trials? Because I know someone brought that up in class. Like if you have one of these conditions, that's like a terminal illness or something, and so you are obviously interested in finding a cure or figuring out if some of these medicines could be a cure. Do clinical trials offer a reasonable alternative to animal testing?
I believe that they do because they microdose you. When you join this experiment, they're not giving you the same dosage that they're giving a little animal that is later going to die because of it. They're microdosing you, seeing how your body adapts, testing that slowly. It's a slow process. However, everything around animal testing is as well. So I feel like it would be worth it. Also, for human testing, they offer bonuses. They give you money to undergo this procedure. Worst case scenario, you might die from something you were already dying from beforehand. Best case, you're cured. So I feel like it should be used more commonly than it is.
One of the videos you shared with us basically offered us what is sometimes called a trolley problem for evaluating the ethics of testing on animals versus testing on humans, even if those humans are willing volunteer subjects. And I'm curious to hear your take on this. They were asking, for example, what if developing a vaccine requires creating suffering and death in a rabbit, but it might end up saving a human life? A lot of people would say, well, it's sad, but the suffering and death of that rabbit is worth it if it goes to saving the life of the human who has a greater degree of moral status than the rabbit. But then they say, well, what happens if you have to create suffering and death in 10 rabbits? Is that equal to one human life? And maybe there again, people would say, no, it's sad, but it's worthwhile. And eventually you would get up, to 100 rabbits or 1,000 rabbits. Or how do the lives of 10 chimpanzees or 100 chimpanzees compared to one human or whatever else? And it gets maybe at some point somewhat more complicated, even for people who don't think that much of animals and their suffering. How many animals of whatever species can be made to suffer and die and justify improving a human life or saving a human life?
I honestly can't put a number on it. It's just sad to see any animal die, but to look at both sides, I can see that people want a cure. They want to be able to fix something that's wrong, so they can see the purpose of killing an animal, but I just personally can't put a number on it.
I also agree. I think it's a very hard line to draw. I do believe that humans have higher moral status than animals. However, there is a definition of insanity that goes into it, of trying the same thing over and over, expecting different results. So at the end of the day, I feel like just too many lives are being lost for it to be justified at a certain point.
What if we were to turn the problem away from life-saving drugs and things and point it towards things like mascara or eyeliner or something like that, a cosmetic product that doesn't save lives? People in the class were talking a lot about things like shampoo. They test that on animals. And if an animal is suffering and dying to create a product like that, how does the calculation change in your mind, or does it change?
Honestly, I think it should be 0 at that point. Cosmetically, I don't think we should be testing on animals, period, because that's just extra fluff added to us. It's not important. It's not a need. We could easily use alternative methods to test shampoos, conditioners, body wash, stuff like that. But for mascara, makeup in general, it should not be tested on animals because they don't deserve that kind of cruelty just to make us feel a little prettier.
In the US, cosmetics is one of the top 13 causes of animal testing. And I agree that these are not essential for human life. These are not what is most important at the end of the day. And we have so many alternative methods, like we said before, with tissue samples that you could take from a human.
Tell us a little bit more about alternatives. I mean, I know people have said part of the tragedy of animal testing is that it's no longer necessary because there's other things that we could be doing to find out if the chemical in that shampoo is going to irritate your eyes or your skin or something like that. So what other options do we have besides testing them on living creatures?
One of the main alternatives that we could have for cosmetic industry is the tissue samples, but also computer modeling, which can simulate the chemical effects on a human body based on what we already have found out through animal testing.
Also, there's just different things like in vitro testing where we grow the human cells and the human tissues. There's also organ donation that we can test on organs for medical things. The computer modeling is a big one too, or organ on a chip is what the organ transplant thing is called. But there's multiple AI uses since AI is becoming a big thing that it can use to simulate human responses to drugs, vaccines, or to any cosmetics.
If these alternatives are effective, why aren't all these companies using them instead?
because it's a different process for the product to come out. You have to go to the ethics board and explain how you're not using animal testing, or if you are, and how it will be effective for human beings. Animal testing has been around so long, it's the quickest option almost. We know it's going to work. We're going to try it. Or you want to do in vitro testing and stuff, but you have to prove that it's going to work. And when you bring that to the board, it can get accepted or rejected. And then you have to start all over again if it does get rejected.
But it sounds like it doesn't work. You said, what, the 95% of cases?
For most vaccines, but people view medical versus cosmetic very differently. And they can make these products quicker to sell on the market, which gets them that money back from the animal testing that they are using.
Yeah, I think it's most like a cost benefit kind of thing for companies in general, because they will spend the least amount of money possible in order to, make the most with consumers.
Because you're not taking care of these animals. You're not feeding them right. You're not putting them in humane cages, cleaning the cages, keeping up to date with their already health issues potentially. They don't matter. So it's easier to just test on them, maybe give them a little bowl of water in their cage, and keep going along.
I know you had given us a video, and I'll put this in the show notes on YouTube. It's a 60-second video of animals in these testing environments that was so brutal. I couldn't get through the whole thing, and a bunch of people in the class said that they didn't finish it just because it was so hard to watch.
Yeah, it was kind of gruesome to see all those animals in cages and the scientists talking about, are you going to take this part or no? And it's just like they talk so badly about these animals, and I know animals can't understand our language. It just hurts knowing that they're treating them and speaking verbally badly to them.
It hurts, but I feel like it is vital for the public to see the harsh reality of what animal testing is doing. Like you said, one of their main phrases was, will you turn your face away from animal testing? Because I feel like most of us do, and that's why people get so defensive whenever this topic is brought up, because they don't want to admit that they use animal testing products in their daily lives, just in your shampoo, your Colgate toothpaste. You're using it multiple times every single day. But again, most of the time it is the cheaper option instead of getting like vegan nail polish.
These practices are out of sight, out of mind for most people because they happen in these windowless laboratories. And to me, it invites a comparison to where our meat supply comes from, because our factory farming apparatus is behind closed doors and in large warehouses with no windows. And what goes on in there is very similar. Animals kept in really inhumane conditions, in really tiny cages, unable to move, or in some cases even like turn around in place, really unsanitary conditions and pumped full of hormones. They live short, painful, miserable lives, and then they're slaughtered. Does your concern for animal testing extend also to factory farming and to meat production?
Yes.
I think it can, yeah. I mostly was surprised at the fact that in the US, you have to have a certain level of clearances in order to go into these factory farms. But in comparison to Japan, you can publicly just walk onto them. They don't hide anything from like how they provide their food and how they make their food. So to compare it to other countries, the US is very secretive.
Also, thinking about what they are pumping into these animals to make the meat bigger, fatter, more delicious. Food additives are also one of the top 13 uses for animal testing. So I think when you look at how many chemicals are pumped into their bodies that we are then consuming as humans, it's only doing more detriment to our health.
I know in a lot of states, and I think maybe Pennsylvania, they've passed laws with steep punishments for anyone who even records video inside a factory farm to show what's being done outside because of PETA activists and others who have snuck cameras into these places. And it's disconcerting to me, too, that the government will side with the industry over any sort of concern for animal welfare. One interesting thought experiment that I like to engage in sometimes is to ask 50 years from now or 100 years from now, when people look back at this time and they identify things that we do that they think are strange or morally indefensible, like, slavery is to us. I think that the way we treat animals is probably going to be on that list. And I think animal testing is going to be included in that. And our factory farming apparatus is going to be included in that. And that history probably will not judge us very kindly for this thing in particular. What do you think?
Yeah, in general, that's definitely going to be a big thing that we look back on and being like, why did we ever use this method? I think that we should even start just thinking of alternative methods, making them cheaper, hopefully, and just being able to push industries and the factory farms to use alternative methods just so morally we humans can take that weight off and not feel as bad when we look back in 50 years.
I feel like there's a lot more that could be done. And I even read an academic journal that said if research conducted on animals continues to be unable to reasonably predict what can be expected in humans, the public's continuing endorsement and funding of preclinical animal research is just misplaced. We're funding the wrong things.
Do you use only like the pain-free products?
I'm not going to sit here and act like I don't. I mean, I think all of us do to a certain extent. Unless you're making your own toothpaste at home, I hate to break it to you, but you're using animal testing products. So you can try your best to avoid it, but it has become such a common normality in the US alone that it's just unavoidable.
I can't play like the not guilty card here. I kind of feel bad, but yeah, I do use animal tested products like shampoo and stuff, but I try to stay away from animal tested foods. I try to look for the cruelty free stuff, at least in that department, but I can't say like my cosmetics. I do use that stuff.
Are either of you vegetarians?
I only eat chicken. That's about it.
I used to be.
I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. This is actually something that I struggle with a bit because, I mean, generally speaking, I try to live an ethical life if I can. And I fall short, of course, in many areas. And one of them for me is that I can't seem to stop eating meat. I've tried to become a vegetarian many times. I probably do use products that are tested on animals. Someone told me that Old Spice is tested on animals, and it really broke me because that's like one of the only brands that I am loyal to. But I think it's something that people should think about and wrestle with a little bit. And I've dealt with my meat addiction by at least trying to reduce it, cut back on it as much as I can if I'm not cutting it out entirely. You know, maybe not eating it at home, but in restaurants, giving myself that allowance. And then maybe a similar option is available where animal testing is concerned. Do you have any advice or recommendations to people who would like to try and reduce their culpability for animal suffering?
I think the number one thing you can do is when you're shopping, at least, you can literally look it up and check to see if it's been animal tested on or used. Products have to have the cruelty-free thing if it is cruelty-free, so you can check these products in person, pick it up with your own hand, and see if there's a marking that says cruelty-free.
I'm not saying cut out meat because it is necessary for our health. I just think it's kind of sad that it has gotten to the point where we are worrying about these things, like what is in our food. Other countries don't deal with this. Their food is fresher and healthier, and we're still struggling with this today with all of the technology and advancements that we have made.
Andrea and Chloe, thanks for joining us on the show today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
This has been another episode of The Art of Conversation, a radio show dedicated to a college course dedicated in turn to the art of conversation. This program has been brought to you by the Eileen G. Jones Honors College and the Department of Communication Studies, Media, and Journalism at Commonwealth University. As always, I'm your host, Eric C. Miller. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll look for you again next time.